Good day, everyone. I am Kara Silby Fernandez, and I am tasked to discuss the remaining topic of the final term of the first semester, which is the lesson 5, the fantasy story and bedtime story for adolescent. I think most of us here, I'm not sure how, but I think most of us here are um, aware about the age bracket um, of an adolescent, which is the 10 to 19 years old, right? So later on, I am going to share with you this kind of fantasy story and bedtime story for adolescent, which is after I read this kind of piece, I am a little bit confused because I think this kind of story is made for everyone or it is appropriate for everyone. But I also believe that this kind of piece is um, more appropriate for the adolescent. So I think naman it is appropriate for everyone because we cannot control each other's perspective because there are young people, children, and adults that I think they love to read this kind of specific genre of a story, and we cannot control it because if that specific person loves to read this kind of genre, I think he might read it without even thinking any age bracket or he or she as a children or he or she is an adolescent or um, he or she an adult. And this whole lesson, I am going to share with you a one of a summary of the story about fantasy and bedtime story for adolescent, which is The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce. And after that, I will discuss the elements of the story and the importance of reading the fantasy story and bedtime story for adolescent. The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce. Not far from the Cincinnati in 1830 lies a great forest occupied by scattered homes of early settlers. Among them is an old, neglected cabin with a front door and boarded up window. For decades, a white-haired man named Merlac has lived there. He looks 70 but is really 50. He lets his yards grow wild and provides for himself by selling animal skins. Merlac is found dead at his cabin, apparently of natural causes. He is buried next to his wife's grave on the property. It is very sad on his part that a few people can remember him, and only the narrator's grandfather knew the cause of Merlac's isolation. Now, only the narrator knows the tale. Let's go back to the story of Merlac's youth. Merlac and his young bride head west and carve a homestead out of forest. One day he returns from hunting to find his wife in a delirium of fever. Doctors are far away, so he tries to help her, but she fades away and all signs of life depart. After this one, he quietly prepares for her body for burial. Without tears and unaccustomed to tragedy, Merlax places her on the table, thinking his grief will pour forth when he puts her in the grave the next day. He feels so very tired, so he sits at the table where she lies and lay his head down to sleep. Through the window, he hears an earthly wail like that of a child lost in the forest. Then he hears it again, this time nearer. He wonders if it is a wild animal or that perhaps he's merely dreaming it. He sleeps. During the night, something wakes him in the room, alert but confused. He listens. The table shakes and he hears footfalls. Terrified, he waits. Suddenly, the table lurches against him. Something heavy falls violently on the floor. He hears a scuffle. He reaches across the table for his wife, but her corpse is gone. Instantly, he grabs for his rifle and fires it without aiming. The blast lights up the room and startles the intruder, a panther dragging the dead body by throat toward the window.
Startled, the panther leaps out the window and disappears. Overcome by terror and sudden violence, Murlocs collapse into unconsciousness. He awakens to a bright day. His wife's body lies disheveled on the floor near the window, a pool of blood from her torn neck coagulating on the floor. The ribbon that tied her hands together in that pose is broken. Her hands are clenched. Clamped between her teeth is part of the panther's ear. After reading this piece, I noticed something. I think that this story is an open-ended story, in the fact that the mystery of his wife is never resolved. There are lots of questions that running on my mind. I think one of these questions that running on your mind also after reading the story or listening the story was that was his wife dead before, or is she a zombie? Was she possessed? And many more questions. So move on from that, we will proceed to the elements of the story of the boarded window. First are the characters of the story. It is no other than Murloc and his wife. Murloc is the protagonist of the story. He appears to have an adventurous spirit in his youth, but life's failures, including his inability to make it as a farmer and his wife's death, have taken their toll on him. He is one of the very few original settlers in the frontier near Cincinnati who did not move on in hopes of finding a better life. He lives alone in a log house in the forest and survives by selling the skin of the animals he hunts. Next is his wife. Murloc's wives appear to have been a good match for him, as she is described as a young woman and always worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and light heart. There is no known record of her name, of her charms of mind and person, as there does not appear to be anyone in the town that still remembers her. The narrator makes assumptions about their affection for each other and happiness together. Next is the setting of the story. The setting of the story can be found on Ohio, the great forest of Cincinnati. Next is the plot of the story. The plot of the story is Murloc's efforts to sustain his wife's life when she becomes ill. After that, the conflict of the story, which is the death of his wife. In this situation, the conflict is man versus self. It is because of the death of his wife and the guilt and grief that he won't let go or get over. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. Next is the resolution of the story. The resolution of the story is when he boards out the window and goes to bury his wife and mourns. In the boarded window, the genre is horror, mystery, and magic realism. The boarded window is a horror short story. The horror content can be clearly observed because of elements like irony and diction, which makes up the mood of the story. The story transitions from the little creepy to horrific and shocking, especially towards the end. Usage of words like forsaken and indigence adds a sense of negativity, creating an eerie effect. Also, the setting up of the story is an immense and unbroken forest, and lets the reader imagine the situation in his mind, further creating a scary effect. The mystery can be observed when narrator describes what Murlocs find in his cabin upon waking up. The clothing was deranged, the long hair is disordered, the limbs lay anyhow, from the throat dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which she had bound the wrist was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear. And lastly, the importance of reading fantasy story and bedtime story for adolescents. The importance of it is to allow the body's adrenaline to calm down so the brain can transition into the sleep state. And also, it helps people, especially the adolescent, to develop their imagination.
Before I end this video discussion, I would like to congratulate everyone for making it to the final term of this semester. As the last reporter of this final term, once again, I am Caracel B. Fernandez and wishing you an advance Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Gracias por escuchar.